But today we have with us a returning guest, Brad Marshall, who I've gotten to know. I had him on to talk about his work with his experiments around the croissant diet of experimenting with stearic acid and mega doses of stearic acid, which is a type of saturated fat in the form of what he calls butter oil, which we can get into a little bit. He is the creator of Fire in a Bottle, as well as Firebrand Meats, where he's developing low PUFA pork and eventually low PUFA chicken products. So thanks for joining me, Brad.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, and it's great having you on because, again, we feel like this is a very frontier space of research, and I am a layman, and I'm just trying to drink up as much information from the folks out there doing the pioneering research, exploring how much omega-6 linoleic acid in particular has seemed to be a elephant in the room for obesity as well as diseases of civilization, these chronic illnesses that plague us today.
I really believe that it is. I know just we had chatted a bit informally yesterday, and you asked me what if we could eliminate one thing from the diet, and I said that would be linoleic acid, and you said what percent of the chronic disease do you think that would eliminate? And my off the cuff guess was 75%. So that's how important I think this is. And, maybe I'll be proven to be wrong, but I think it's a big deal.
And just to put this into context for folks, because we got a lot of folks, general audience, low carbers, keto, paleo, carnivore, we got plant-based vegans. So again, we're not trying to make any specific estimation. We're just trying to give a picture, a visual for people about the importance of these seed oils.
So, right. And one thing I think is interesting that you just kind of pointed out is I think this is a topic that cuts across every sort of dietary genre, whether or not you're a carnivore or a vegan. I think this is still an important conversation and something to understand,
Although I have a lot of problems with the long-term health effects of veganism, I think it can be done healthily without having high amounts of seed oils in the diet.
Yeah, I think, right. I agree. I think that would be the main thing.
So it's like, I am a fan of Rene Girard, who is the late anthropologist from Stanford University. He said that all human societies function on the basis of an effective scapegoat that everybody can be bound against. And that's what we can unite all the tribes around, the scapegoat.
Right.
In this case, scapegoat, we think of it as, that means the innocent. But in this case, it's more of a psychosocial phenomenon where we bind together in our mutual shared casting out of these toxic vegetable oils. That's what's going to unite all the clans together, apparently.
Yeah, I like it.
So, so just to illustrate this again, just for folks who are new to this. So you said, again, we're just giving a visual. So we just don't write this number down and say, how did you equate this? How did you get this equation? So visual, 75% of these diseases, of chronic illness diseases, these comorbidities associated with Western American diets, potentially could have been solved if we had everything the same in our diets, but just taken out the seed oil part of the equation in every case for the last century.
Yeah, I think so. But it's also important to understand that, the linoleic acid is sneaking in all kinds of places. It's not just the soybean oil that you add to your, you like saute your vegetables in or fry your French fries in. It's also it's in all the packaged goods, and it's also in our pork and in our chicken, which is obviously something that I've been pushing on. A lot of, I'll start with this. A lot of commercial chicken, probably most commercial chicken in the U.S. is between 30 and 40% linoleic acid.
Now, what does that mean? The 30 to 40% linoleic acid, 30 for
right.
40% of its fat, or 30 or
so
40%
yes, yes. Yes, good catch. Yeah. So of the fat of the chicken, so like the chicken's skin, right, is mostly fat. There's some protein in there and water too, but it's mostly fat. And of that fat that renders out when you like roast a bird, the fat in the pan is about 30%, 30 to 40% linoleic acid in an average U.S. chicken. And so, when we think about canola oil is linoleic acid is only around, I think, 18 or 19%. So I think that average bacon fat is probably, when you render bacon and you get the pure kind of lard that cooks out, I think that's around 18% to 20% on average in American pigs, but it can be higher.
Linoleic acid.
Is linoleic acid, right? Which is a
subset of omega-6, right?
Right. It's the most commonly found omega-6 polyunsaturated fat, which is often just abbreviated as PUFA, polyunsaturated fatty acid, PUFA. That's what that stands for. And so omega-6, linoleic acid makes up about 52% of soybean oil, right? And it makes up, it's less. It's lower in canola oil has more monounsaturated fat, but it still has a lot of, in my opinion, it still has a lot of linoleic acid up at, around 20%. But the thing is, okay, so if canola oil is maybe 18 to 20% and soybean oil is the worst, and that's up at 52%, and chicken is 30%. That's kind of right in the middle between canola oil and soybean oil. And I think people just don't realize, and bacon fat can be 30%. I stayed at a friend's recently, and they eat bacon, and they had a can of bacon grease that they kept next to their stove, and it was in Maine, and it was cool out. It wasn't warm, and at sort of cool room temperature, their bacon fat was like a pure liquid, which is not a good sign in my opinion. So I think that bacon grease was probably 30% linoleic acid is my guess. I didn't spend the $300 to have it tested, but
now that's
I was curious too.
Another omega-6 fat is arachidonic acid. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
That's different from linoleic acid, right?
Right. So linoleic acid linoleic acid can be converted to arachidonic acid in your body, and the same thing is true in pigs and chickens. So they will convert some of the linoleic acid into arachidonic acid. Usually in their, if you look at different tissues, the ratio of linoleic acid to arachidonic acid changes a lot. Usually if we're talking about like body fat, like chicken fat or rendered lard, you're going to have a lot more linoleic acid than you're going to have arachidonic acid. But yes, you're right. There's more omega-6 fats in the lard and in the chicken than just the linoleic acid.
And arachidonic acid can also be problematic, right?
I think in high amounts, yeah. I mean, there's some, these, right? Like we call the polyunsaturated fats essential, and they do play some important roles. And so, I think there are certain biological functions that arachidonic acid is really useful in, but how much do we really need? It's probably a tiny, tiny amount, right? Or much less than we're actually getting.
Right. My point is, we're eating way too much of it, so it's poisoning by the dose, right? Too much.
Right. And I think it's double. I think it's one that we, we have these enzymes, and they can convert the polyunsaturated fats. So there's two main families of polyunsaturated fats: is the omega-6 and the omega-3. And the thing is, they compete for the same enzymes. So if you eat way too much omega-6 and not enough omega-3, the omega-6 basically shut out the omega-3s from being able to go into these enzymes and get made into the things they're supposed to be made in. And so you just end up unbalanced. But I also think that, so a lot of people hear that and they think, well, I should eat more omega-3. But I would say, no, you probably get plenty of omega-3. You just probably need less omega-6. I think we need less polyunsaturated fat overall, and we probably should also think about a better balance of omega-6 and omega-3. But yeah.
Now, what about,
just,
I've heard the argument that, well, you can eat pasture-raised chicken because the type of linoleic acid somehow is not as hazardous as the bleached, deodorized, industrially produced seed oil version of linoleic acid found in these vegetable oils. What about that?
well, yes. So there is. So one of the problems with polyunsaturated fats is they are prone to oxidation, and they make all kinds of end products like 4-HNE and 9 and 13 HODE, HODE, and all of these kind of lipid peroxides and these kind of like bad things. And sure, I believe that vegetable oil is probably going to have a lot more of that stuff sort of out of the bottle than a fresh pasture chicken. But nonetheless, if you're eating a lot of linoleic acid, you're eating a lot of linoleic acid, and it can still oxidize in your body, right? It doesn't have to come out of the bottle oxidized. And so, yeah, I just think it's probably best avoided. And for a lot of reasons, and not just for the fact that it oxidizes, but we'll talk later about torpor and what that means and how it's triggered by linoleic acid and what that means for our metabolism, etc. But anyway, yeah.
I brought up your concept of torpor and its connection to PUFA to Professor Bruce Hammock of UC Davis, and he was very interested in that idea. So I think you may be up to something. And,
Excellent.
That's something that needs further exploration. We'll get to a little bit of that today. So generally speaking, okay, I want to visualize this again. And this is not, again, meant to be a precise term, but just meant to be a visualization of priority of problems. So you suggested 75% just as a visual of chronic illnesses and obesity-related diseases could have been avoided if we had gone in. Because again, because everybody knows they're inundated with data. They're inundated with junk food is bad. Junk food is bad. This is bad. This is, and it's just so much noise. And I'm trying to try to sort and categorize and organize for people so we can finally start getting a handle on this. So we've got the big boogeyman. We've got processed flour, right?
Right.
The grains. We've got refined sugar. So, and then we've got these vegetable oils. And then other people think, red meat is the big villain. So let's just start with processed flour. Imagine we had eaten the same standard American diet for the last century. From 2021 to 1921, we just did the same exact thing, but we got rid of all the refined grains out of the variable, kept all the vegetable oils the same way, kept the sugar the same way, kept everything else the same way. But we did it's like a wormhole, another multiverse where we just took out the vegetable seed oils and the canola oil fed, the corn and soy fed chicken fat and all these different things. We just removed that part out of it, but all the variables stayed the same. How much of a reduction in chronic illnesses could we have had if we had just removed the processed grain thing?
Well, all right. So
5%. You get what I'm trying to say? I'm trying to visualize the damage.
Right. Sure. Yeah. I mean, what would it be if we remove processed grains versus vegetable oils? I actually have a very good anecdote for that. So I've been reading a lot. I have the 1939 USDA Yearbook of Agriculture. And it's very interesting. It's called Food and Life. And it's all about, they have a whole chapter dedicated to, what do Americans eat? Right, in the 1930s. And it's actually fascinating. One of the things that is very clear is that in the 1930s, the more money that people had, the more food they bought and presumably ate. And this was, there's this strong and direct correlation. And this is mostly people living in cities. So these are not all right, so if I live in Manhattan in 1935 and I'm a banker, I take the subway to work, or I take the cab, or I take a cab to work, and I go up the elevator and sit at my desk all day, and then I take a cab back home, right? I'm not super active. I'm largely a sedentary person. And according to the USDA, the wealthiest Americans in the 1930s, per the average man was buying at least around 4,500 calories a day, right? And what was that? What's the food? It's white flour, it's sugar, it's potatoes, it's meat, it's butter, and it's milk, and it's fruit and vegetables. They did eat a lot of pie. That's not a myth. So in 1939, a banker living in Manhattan, was eating 3 meals a day of, meat and potatoes and apple pie, and somehow wasn't fat and wasn't diabetic, despite the fact that he was sedentary. And I find that fascinating. I think that's a fascinating fact. And they might have wasted a little of that food. They probably didn't eat all of it, but that was a frugal generation. It was the Great Depression. I don't think they were buying, 4,500 calories a day of food to throw out half of it. And so, so that's that kind of anecdote is why I think that there's been, an underlying metabolic change between then and now. And that's why I think that I think there's been an underlying metabolic change triggered by diet, triggered by these polyunsaturated fats. And that's why I think that in 1939, people could eat 4,000 calories a day easily. On the West Coast, it says men on the West Coast, every day, who are the wealthiest men, were buying 5,100 calories of food per day. That's according to the USDA in 1939. So
and they didn't have obesity problems.
Right, and they don't have obesity problems.
How many kids were they feeding with that?
Well, no, this is adjusted. This is adjusted for the number of people in the family. They call it per capita adjusted to the average adult male. So if you were if you had like a wife and 2 kids in your household, the wife would count as like 0.7 adult males, and a 12-year-old might count as 0.8, and a 16-year-old might count as like 1.2 adult males. You know what I mean? So they had a way of kind of like figuring out like this is literally.
Talk about patriarchal science. My goodness.
Well, that's how it all was back then. That's how it was back then.
0.7 of a man here. Goodness.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Well, yeah. No, but that's how the USDA calculated things back then. And that's, but so they say after they adjusted for per capita and the household size and everything, per adult man, if you lived in a Pacific Coast city in 1939, it was 5,100 calories per day of white flour, sugar,
and
potatoes.
You're eating that, or you're
beef.
just buying that?
Well, I mean, presumably they were eating most of it. I don't know why they would have been. Why would they have bought 5,100 calories a day to then throw half of it out? I mean, they didn't sit in their house and watch to make sure they were eating all of it, but presumably they were eating 90% of it.
And what are we eating now?
2,400.
So we've cut our Wait a second. So we've cut our calories in half, but we've tripled in size. Is that what?
Yes, that's what I'm telling you. Yes.
So we've created this stupid myth, this self-flagellating myth that we're just a bunch of lazy potato head losers that can't get off the couch. We suck so bad compared to previous generations as it pertains to health.
Yes.
But it's not true. It's because we've introduced this variable, which is the PUFA vegetable oils, right? That's
what I'm arguing. Yes. And I don't know if do you want to go into it now, but since we're on the thread, I might as well say it. So another study that I just wrote about on the blog Fire in a Bottle recently is about hibernating ground squirrels, right? And so it turns out that all mammals, have these alternate metabolic states that they can live in. And one of them is called torpor. So what is torpor? Torpor is a metabolic state that hibernating mammals need to get into as a prerequisite to hibernating. It's not the same as hibernating. It's an alternative metabolic state driven by a couple of enzymes. I'll throw their names out there if people want to look it up, but don't focus too much on it. So PPAR gamma is a transcription factor that's hugely important in like driving this. And there's something called SREB-P, which is a regulator of fat metabolism. And there's another enzyme called SCD1, which unsaturates our fat. And they all kind of work together. There's these elongases, and they all work together to produce, they're called lipogenic genes, which means fat making, right? So there's all these genes that turn on to make us and keep us fat. And so if you're a hibernating animal, you need to get into that mode in order to preserve your fat mass, store fat for winter, and then successfully overwinter on, you know, whatever stored body fat that you have, right? And so if you take ground squirrels and you give them 8% of their food as linoleic acid, right?
As their caloric intake?
Is there that's a percentage by weight. So that's like probably 16 to 8. That's probably 18% of calories as linoleic acid.
Of the weight of the food they're eating.
It's 8% of the weight of the food that they're eating, which probably means 18 to 20% of the calories that they're eating is from linoleic acid, which, by the way, you could easily get if you were eating mostly chicken. So, or bacon.
So to the keto guys out there, be careful.
Right. And so these squirrels, if they're given that much linoleic acid, what they do in the lab is they take the food away and they turn down the temperature till it's like refrigerator temperature, which is supposed to signal the onset of winter, right? And the squirrels given, these are ground squirrels, they're hibernating squirrels. The squirrels given 8% linoleic acid in their diet, they happily start hibernating within a few days, and they curl up and they go to sleep for winter. Everything's fine, life is good. Another group of squirrels, if you only give them 1.5% linoleic acid in their diet, and then you do the same thing, they also gain some fat, but not as much. And then when they take the food away and turn the temperature down, they totally fail to hibernate, and they, in fact, burn off their entire winter reserve of fat in about 9 days. So squirrels not given sufficient linoleic acid burn through their entire winter reserve of fat in 9 days, whereas squirrels given enough linoleic acid become torpid, and they are able to hold on to their fat mass, and they're able to hibernate successfully because they were given enough linoleic acid. And so the squirrels given the linoleic acid have this whole family of upregulated enzymes: SCD1, PPAR gamma, the whole thing, SREB-P. And so they're in this alternate metabolic state, which actually makes them leptin resistant.
Leptin is, for folks, tell people leptin.
Right. So leptin is a hormone made in our fat cells, and what it does, and basically it increases. It just, the more fat fat cells just kind of release leptin at a regular rate, and so the more fat you have, the more leptin you have, because it's all just releasing leptin all the time. And that, and I mean circulating leptin in your bloodstream. And what leptin does, well, there's the thing that everyone thinks that leptin does, and it does do that, which is control satiety in your hypothalamus, and it reduces the amount of food that you eat. But perhaps more importantly, leptin controls your metabolic rate. So, what quote unquote should happen is, if you overeat and you pack on a few pounds, you make more leptin. Leptin increases your metabolic rate. So it should be progressively harder to get fatter, because you should be fighting ever increasing amount of leptins, which should make your metabolic rate ever higher. That's how biology is supposed to work, and that's why most animals are not super obese, right? But so how do you avoid that cycle of leptin if you want to get really fat? Well, you have to turn on this lipogenic family of genes. You have to turn on the SCD1 and the PPAR gamma, and what they do is they make your fat really unsaturated, because the way that leptin actually increases your metabolic rate is actually by driving reactive oxygen species in your mitochondria. And that sounds a little crazy and counterintuitive, because people say, well, aren't reactive oxygen species bad? And I'm saying that, in fact, that process of driving reactive oxygen species during fat metabolism is the point of leptin. Mostly that's what leptin does. And when that happens, your metabolic rate increases. There's a whole other complex of things that happen with these uncoupling proteins, and it allows you to basically do thermogenesis, which is just burning off calories as heat, right? And so if you're a hibernating animal, you don't want to do those things. You don't want to listen to leptin. You don't want to create reactive oxygen species. You don't want to do thermogenesis. You want to store your fat. And so you have to avoid leptin. So how do you avoid leptin? You make your fat really unsaturated, because unsaturated fat doesn't generate the same amount of reactive oxygen species in the mitochondria that saturated fat does. And so if you can, and so
how do they make their fat unsaturated? By eating PUFAs, right?
Well, that's step one. So what happens is when you eat the polyunsaturated fat, it triggers this torpor, and torpor is actually defined by this upregulated, or at least I've defined it as this upregulated enzyme called SCD1. And all that SCD1 does is it converts your saturated fat to monounsaturated fat. So it instead of stearic acid, which is an 18-carbon saturated fat, you have oleic acid, which is an 18-carbon monounsaturated fat. Instead of palmitic acid, you have palmitoleic acid, which is a 16-carbon unsaturated fat. And so the very unsaturated vegetable oil is the trigger that says, okay, winter's coming. We need to get into torpor. And what your body does enzymatically is to enhance, the unsaturated fat that's coming in is like, okay, we need to do even more of this, because clearly we are trying to become leptin resistant, because we don't want to be burning our extra calories. We want to be fattening up for winter. And so it starts with, so linoleic acid is the trigger, but then once it's triggered, it's really an enzymatic thing. And what's really unfortunate about it is that once you're in torpor, the end products of torpor increase the transcription factors, which turn on all of the torpid genes. So like, if you make a lot of, so PPAR gamma,
you got to explain this as you go if you can.
Yeah. So PPAR gamma, what it is they call it a master controller of fat metabolism. And what PPAR gamma does is a transcription factor, which means that it turns other genes on or off. So it's kind of like one of the bosses of your metabolism, right? It's a big
signaling molecule.
It's a big player. Well, it what it literally does is it goes into the nucleus of the cell, and it binds to your DNA at certain points where it's like, okay, we need to make this gene. And so it binds there. And once it binds there, that gene gets produced. And so, genes can always be on or off. But what turns them on or off are these transcription factors. And so, what happens is certain processes, right? You might need whatever, 15 or 50 or 100 genes to do this one thing, whatever that thing is. Maybe the cell needs to replicate, maybe it needs to, all the different things that it might want to do are controlled by these transcription factors. They're the boss, basically. They control all the other genes, more or less. And so what happens is you eat enough linoleic acid, this PPAR gamma gets upregulated, and it makes, and the PPAR gamma makes, it makes a bunch of things, but three of the things that makes are something called fatty acid synthase. That's an enzyme that just makes fat. So whatever substrate it has available to it, could be other fat, could be, blood glucose, could be a lot of things, but it's going to start turning that into fat. And then, but it can only make palmitic acid, which is a 16-carbon saturated fat. And that is the end product of what we call de novo lipogenesis or fat making. It makes this thing called palmitic acid. And then there's two other enzymes that are, again, upregulated by PPAR gamma, which is an elongase, which takes that 16-carbon palmitic acid and just adds 2 more carbons onto it to make it an 18-carbon stearic acid. And then SCD1, which is a desaturase, comes in and makes a single double bond And now that stearic acid is oleic acid, which is the monounsaturated fat found in olive oil. And so if you look at very obese human, I was just looking at a study this morning of morbidly obese Americans, and if you look at their ratio of how much oleic acid versus how much stearic acid they have compared to controls that are relatively lean, they have 50% more oleic acid. Like they're basically rapidly converting their saturated fat into this monounsaturated fat. And this is true literally in obese Americans today. And this has been shown in many, many studies. Like there's a thing called the desastrous index. And what it is it's like, how much monounsaturated fat do you have versus how much saturated fat do you have? And that is just an indicator of this enzyme SCD1, which is like keeping your fat unsaturated, which is keeping you leptin resistant, which is keeping you in torpor, basically. And anyways, the point I was getting to, and let me just make this point real quick. And so, but the point is that the PPAR gamma makes all these enzymes. The enzymes make oleic acid. Oleic acid upregulates PPAR gamma, which makes more enzymes, which makes more oleic acid, which upregulates PPAR gamma. You see the problem? It's like a positive feedback loop. And so the more active that this family of enzymes is, the more of these monounsaturated end products there are, which increase the rate of the enzymes which are making the monounsaturated fats in the first place. Because why does this happen? Well, because it happens because if you're an animal that needs to hibernate, it's very important that once you signal to your body, winter's coming, we need to get ready for hibernation, we're going to eat a bunch of this linoleic acid, the body doesn't know that the linoleic acid is going to stick around forever. It knows, okay, we need to get ready for hibernation. Once we've made this decision, once we've flipped this metabolic switch, we need to make sure that we stay here. And that's why I think there's this positive feedback loop of the end products upregulating the enzymes that make the end products, et cetera. And so once you get into torpor, it's not entirely clear how you get out of it. That's, I think, one of the problems that we have.
So we're all a bunch of Winnie the Poohs running around, or all over. We're in constant state of hibernation.
Right. And so if you look at any
we have sleepy people. We have
that's exactly what we have.
They call them low energy Jeb Bush, but it's not just Jeb Bush, it's everybody's low energy apparently. if your hypothesis is correct, right?
Right, no, exactly. And you can look around. I mean, it's like I say, it's easy to show. It has been showed many times that the higher your desaturase index is, the higher your waist circumference is. People who have a defect, a genetic defect in their SCD1 gene and have a defective SCD1 tend to remain lean. On average, their waist circumference is 2 inches less than.
Are you telling me that all the skinny guys are the defects and us big guys are the natural products? We're the real deal?
That is one way to look at it. I mean, that's a fairly rare gene mutation, so I don't know how relevant
any science that confirms that I am the normal and everybody else is defective.
Well, look, I think the normal is if we eat enough vegetable oil, if we eat enough linoleic acid, and most of us have, we will enter into this alternate metabolic state of torpor. And I think that's what most of us have managed to do based on, the fact that.
Why are so many people remaining very relatively thin while they're eating they're guzzling the pizzas with the soybean oil. They dip the pizza into the garlic butter sauce, which is nothing but soybean oil. They guzzle, chips.
Right. Well, I mean, that's a really good.
They're thin as a stick. What the hell
is
going on here?
Well, I mean,
defective, right? I'm just
right. They probably are the defective ones. I mean, you're right. That's always a really interesting question: is why aren't we all then, whatever, 400 pounds? But and that's a harder question to answer. And I think probably for any, obviously genetics is a complicated thing, and it depends on a lot of things. It depends on, It starts with your mother, maybe your grandmother, I don't know, and the fats that you got as an infant, and then it depends on your genetics. Like I say, if I've got a gene, if I have an alteration where my SCD1 gene is not functional, I'm going to be leaner. I can probably eat the vegetable oil and stay lean. It's fine. I won't get into torpor if I don't have a functional SCD1 gene, right?
Now, what's it? Go ahead. Did you want to finish your sentence?
Yeah, and I was just going to say, like, there's other metabolic things, like you might have more active or higher expression of like uncoupling genes, and they increase your metabolic rate, and so you might just genetically be making a lot of these uncoupling genes, or something in the current diet is triggering that, and that's another thing that might keep you lean. Just uncoupling proteins keep your metabolic rate up. We could talk about that. It's a little complicated, but
so just a big sketch here, though, from the nature standpoint. I was hearing, I think it was Jeff Nobbs. Somebody said they had a blog where they were, maybe it was you, I don't know, but they were talking about how, like, so you've got these PUFA heavy plants, then you got the monounsaturated plants, and you got saturated heavy plants. The PUFA plants tend to be in the colder climates, right? Because the fat stays liquid at freezing, at cold points, right?
Exactly.
And then the monounsaturated heavy plants like olives, they're going to be in more temperate climates, right? More moderate climates.
Right.
And then the saturated fat heavy plants like cocoa, butter, and coconut oil are going to be in the tropical climates where it's hot as hell all the time, right?
Exactly. Right. And so I think
animals, so you're talking about hibernating animals. So if your hypothesis is correct, then hibernating animals are going to be in areas where they're going to eat food like fish or plants. They're going to have a lot of the higher PUFA fat that they need themselves to survive during the winter. The plant needs it to survive during the winter, but also the animal needs to get that PUFA fat so as to stimulate fat growth, not just from the dietary consumption of the PUFA fat, but also triggering the enzymes that make fat storage more possible from the other sources of food that they're eating as well. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes. And I would give, and I, there's a fun little thing I'm thinking about. So it's tempting to think that mammals evolved using like acorns, let's say, this crop that comes down in the fall, and that's triggering us like something like a ground squirrel to go into hibernation, right? Because all of a sudden this PUFA rich food is here and we eat it. It turns out that doesn't really make sense because mammals evolved before flowering plants did. Trees are flowering plants. So we were actually here before acorns were. I believe that acorns evolved because the acorns were useful to the mammals who were already here, like squirrels, and the acorns were like, oh, if we become a tool for these hibernating squirrels, they'll spread our seeds for us. So I think the chicken and egg is actually backwards on that one, but either way, there's clearly this association between mammals eating PUFA in the fall to get into torpor. If we look at the oldest,
how did they eat? How did they get into torpor before acorns?
So if we look at the oldest mammals on the family tree, there's three kinds of mammals, three main branches of the mammalian family tree. There are egg-laying mammals, which include
there's damn dirty apes. That's us.
Well, right. We're placental mammals.
Okay.
And then in the middle there's marsupials, which are placental, and then there's egg-laying mammals. So the egg-laying mammals are the most ancient of all of the mammals, and the duck-billed platypus is the most widely.
He's loaded with PUFA, isn't he?
Well, I don't know about him, but his buddy, the spiny anteater, is an egg-laying mammal who hibernates. And what they eat to get into torpor are ants, because remember that a warm-blooded metabolism is unique to birds and mammals. So we're the only ones who have torpor, right? Ants don't need to get into torpor, but they do freeze solid in the winter. And so they have to have very unsaturated fat because of issues like membrane permeability, right? So ants need to. So if you look at the ants, they make tons and tons and tons of monounsaturated fat. They have very high levels, presumably of PPAR alpha and SCD1. And so when ants store fat, they store it in highly, monounsaturated. Is that
confirmed,
form.
or you just
No, this is confirmed. This is confirmed. There's a study about it in well, I can't remember where
ants have a high amount of monounsaturated fat in
ants. Right. And so they looked at these spiny anteaters, and they looked at the ants that were the main food source in their diet, and the fat levels of the anteaters and the ants match each other almost perfectly, but they have very, very, very high levels of monounsaturated fats. And so I think that you could get into torpor. Well, based on that, you can get into torpor just by eating tons and tons and tons of monounsaturated fat. But more common, but it's easier. It's a lot easier to get there by eating polyunsaturated fats.
I see.
Yeah. And so I think probably, if you look at the most ancient things, they probably got there by eating ants, but also things like salmon.
The ants have polyunsaturated fat too?
They have a little bit, but mostly they have they have this upregulated enzymatic system, the one we do, and they have tons and tons of monounsaturated fats.
So how did the egg-laying mammal ancestors get enough PUFA from a monounsaturated loaded ant? Maybe I missed it.
Well, yeah. So let me clarify. So I think that the trigger to go in. So again, I think that the leptin works by generating reactive oxygen species. And if your fat is unsaturated enough, and it doesn't really matter if it's monounsaturated or polyunsaturated, if your fat is unsaturated enough at the end of the day, you can probably get into torpor. And it doesn't really matter if it's from monounsaturated fat or polyunsaturated fat, but the polyunsaturated fat will get you there a lot quicker than will the monounsaturated fat. So an anteater is eating ants. I presume their majority of their calories are from fat, and it eats nothing, which means they're probably eating, 60% of their calories as monounsaturated fat, right? They're eating tremendous numbers of these ants, and the ants are all full of this very unsaturated fat. And so that can get you into torpor. And which is why I also don't recommend eating much of things like olive oil or avocado oil or, even macadamia nut oil, because I think that once your fat is already super unsaturated, don't add to the problem by continuing to consume monounsaturated fats. I think if you're healthy, some amount of monounsaturated fats are fine, but I think any unsaturated fats in too much quantity can put you into this same metabolic issue.
What about because you said healthy, but that's a broad term. Someone could be thin, eating lots of saturated fats, and be like, okay, I'm just going to keep eating them because I'm not overweight. But these unsaturated fats in a high amounts could be causing other diseases, autoimmune diseases, pain.
For sure. And I'm thinking. I'm thinking specifically about, my blog and my research is specifically about metabolic health, and it's about these issues around, polyunsaturated fats, how they affect our metabolism. And I guess when I say healthy, what I really mean is non-torpid, right? I mean, when I say a healthy person, I mean someone who doesn't have this upregulated PPAR gamma SCD1 thing happening. If you are normal in your desaturase index, you can probably eat some olive oil and it's fine. But once you become, I want to call it dysregulated, but it's not really dysregulated. This is normal mammalian physiology, right? If you eat a whole bunch of PUFA, you upregulate PPAR gamma and SCD1. That's just what happens. So it's not really dysregulation. We've sort of made a decision. I mean, obviously we didn't do it on purpose, but as a society, we've made a decision to eat these polyunsaturated fats, and it's pushing us into this alternate metabolic reality, right?
Do humans need to be in torpid mode a little bit?
I mean, if you want to get fat for winter. I don't think so, though. I think that the vast Here's a fun anecdote.
climate? Do you need to get a little fat for the winter?
Here's a fun anecdote. So, and I have an article on my blog called Bear Hunting Season. Native Americans ate a lot of bear grease, bear fat, from black bears specifically. They considered grizzly bears to be inedible, most of them.
Why?
I don't know. I'm not sure. They say it's nasty. There may be other reasons, but they didn't eat grizzly bears. They did eat lots of black bear fat, though. And what's interesting about that is that black bears are fattest in the fall. They graze on acorns. They become torpid. They become very fat, right? They're getting ready for winter. And then as they sleep through the winter, they actually preferentially oxidize the polyunsaturated fat that they've stored in their body fat. And they also lose, half or more of their body fat over the course of the winter, right? They burn off their stored fat as they hibernate. And so the question is, did Native Americans hunt bears in the fall when they were at their fattest and when the fat yield would have been the greatest, or did they hunt them in the spring when the bears were leanest and therefore had the lowest yields, but the fat was lowest in polyunsaturated fat? And the answer is that they hunted them in the spring or in late winter. So they literally, the bears were in their lair sleeping in November. They could have gone in November and killed the bears and gotten this huge yield of fat. Instead, they waited until the bears had burned off the majority of their body fat, and then they hunted them for their fat, presumably because they didn't want to eat the pufa, because they probably knew that would make them cold in winter or make them fat. I don't know. It would
make them cold.
Well, so your body temperature,
keep you warm
your body temperature and your general feeling of warmth is all generated by your ability to do thermogenesis. And so the way that leptin keeps you thin is by increasing your metabolic rate and therefore increasing the amount of heat that your body's producing. And the best way to lower your metabolic rate is to eat lots of polyunsaturated fats or lots of unsaturated fats in general. And so the Native Americans probably realized that, okay, if we eat the winter bear fat, we're cold in the winter. And if we eat the spring bear fat, we're okay. That's my guess as to how the Native Americans would know this, right?
So eating pufa for the bear helps them stay warm, but for us, it makes us feel cold during the winter.
No, because one of the things that hibernating animals do in the winter is they drop their body temperature. They have to save their fat, they have to lower their metabolic rate. So
they feel colder too.
Well, something prevents them, I think, from feeling cold, but because obviously they're doing something. They're hibernating on purpose, but their body temperature drops substantially when they, squirrels, when they hibernate, their body temperature can get down to like almost freezing. They can be like 35 degrees. The bear, the temperature doesn't drop that much because they're bigger. So even with a lower metabolic rate, they stay warmer because they have a high, mass to surface ratio. It comes down to physics. But but the bears drop their temperature by maybe like 10 or 15 degrees Fahrenheit when they're hibernating. And, you can't do that if you're responding to leptin and doing a lot of thermogenesis. You're not going to be able to drop your body temperature like that. And so when you look at Americans, our body temperatures have dropped something like 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the 1800s, and
that's PUFA. You're hypothesizing that's PUFA.
I'm hypothesizing that is because of PUFA and torpor. Yes.
And when you're lower body temperature, that's more prone for infection too, right? Or no?
I'm not sure about that. It may well be. I don't know. Obviously we increase our body temperature when we get an infection to sort of hamper the thing that's infecting us, but I'm not sure if the converse is true. Maybe.
So if a bear was fed coconut oil, which is a saturated fat, they wouldn't be able to make it through the winter?
That would be an interesting experiment to do. Well, like I said, the squirrels who are not given enough linoleic acid literally fail to hibernate.
Okay.
Totally fail to hibernate. They can't do it.
Instead?
They were eating mostly starch, I think.
Okay. So why is it that Native Americans seem to have reacted to the introduction of vegetable oils with a higher rate of obesity than, say, Asian Americans? You know, I mean, or I'm not talking about Americans, just in general, Native Americans versus, Chinese population that consumes vegetable oils. They don't seem to express obesity to the same degree as, for example, other populations do who eat the same amount of vegetable oils. Is that because they're in a different climate, or what's going on with that? Different.
I mean, it could just be a genetic difference, and the Native Americans, living a traditional lifestyle, able to select any foods that they wanted. They had this cultural knowledge of how to do that and how to stay, good, right? And then once they're on a reservation and, the government is bringing them and Tucker Goodrich has done great work on this where, the government was bringing them lard, but the lard was actually 50% cottonseed oil. The U.S. lard producing companies have been adulterating lard with cottonseed oil since the 1800s. And so, Native Americans started to eat things like fry bread because, that was all, once they were on reservations and economically displaced, all they could afford was the food that the government would bring them, which was basically white flour and white sugar and quote unquote lard, which was really, 40% cottonseed oil. And that is obviously not a great, and also, I also love the China Health Study. It's a complex thing, but the original study, the raw data out of the original study done in the 80s, they went to China and they studied exactly what everyone was eating and all this stuff. And the fact is they didn't eat vegetable oil. Vegetable oil is not a traditional food in Asia. So I don't think you can say that the Native Americans were eating the same amount of.
But Chinese Americans would probably be eating about as much as the average American is now, right? Of vegetable oil. And they don't.
That's true. I mean, yeah, if you compare them to Chinese America, that's true. And like I say, there are real genetic differences in, people's ability to store fat. I mean, and I think Indians, meaning not meaning Native Americans, but meaning people from India, for instance, tend to do not put on a lot of subcutaneous fat, but they can put on a lot of visceral fat. And so I think
difference for our listeners.
Right. So subcutaneous fat is the fat that's it's on your back. It's on your back. It's on your butt. It's on your thighs. Whereas
white fat versus brown fat are two different. That's a different topic.
Well, no, it's all white fat. Humans don't make a lot of brown fat. Brown fat is very common in rodents, and it's interesting. It's highly metabolically active. It makes a lot of something called uncoupling protein 1, UCP1, and so they're very good at doing thermogenesis. Which is, again, uncoupling proteins and thermogenesis is the job of leptin. And that's what, we've been able to avoid through the magic of seed oil. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm not an expert on the Native Americans or Asians in America, but I will say
subcutaneous fat versus visceral fat with Indians. What was the difference now?
For whatever reason, and visceral fat is the fat that's right in your, if you have a beer belly, that's visceral fat. It's the fat that's right in your gut. And, for whatever reason, Indians seem to be a lot more prone to putting on visceral fat, where people of European descent are they also put on visceral fat, but they're much better at storing subcutaneous fat. And storing subcutaneous fat can be can be helpful for, if you're torpid, if you have a low metabolism, the ability to add subcutaneous fat can actually keep you out of diabetes, because now you're just storing all of your energy. You're not, right? You've stopped burning your energy efficiently, so you just start storing it, and you can still retain some level of metabolic health, whereas Indians who can't store the subcutaneous fat, they don't get as fat, but they also become diabetic more easily. So it's a mixed bag.
Could that also be the same thing happening for folks who are not Indian but are remaining thin while eating lots of vegetable oils like most Americans do?
Absolutely, it could. Absolutely, it could be. Yes. And you know, so yeah, so there's all kinds of genetic variation, you know, in
Right.
human populations. And so it's hard to paint everyone with the same brush, but
Could be a similar
yeah,
mechanism taking place, is what we're saying.
it could be. Yeah, I think so.
So there's a lot here. And again, we're just at the beginnings of this. There needs to be, how many people are even looking into the topic I mean, you got to wonder literally
I
how many
mean,
people.
I'm impressed how much, you know, it's funny. It's like some of these little topics are like their weird little rabbit hole, you know. And once I started looking at the papers about hibernating mammals and torpor, there's actually a pretty decent amount of literature on that stuff, on that, you know, on that topic. And you know, they realized even like the study with the ground squirrels and the given 8% versus 1% linoleic acid, I think that happened in like 1995. I think that was published. So, you know, people have actually known for a long time that hibernating animals need linoleic acid or polyunsaturated fat to trigger hibernation mode, and they know that those animals make a lot of PPAR gamma and SCD1 to hibernate, and they know that that helps them store their fat mass for the winter. And this has been known for 30 years, but for some reason, I don't know, I guess I'm the first one to like connect the two dots. Or, you know, maybe Ray Peat did before me. He's another guy that people talk about thinking along these lines. But yeah, it's just, it's interesting. You know, the more that I look at it and the more I go out on these different, like I was looking the other day, I was like, and so the desaturase index is, which like I say, is the amount of these monounsaturated fats that you have in your fat tissue versus the saturated fats, you know, that's been shown since at least, you know, 2005 to be a very strong predictor of obesity in many papers, and in both in the US, and I know it's been done in Sweden. So, you know, a lot of this stuff is pretty well established. It's just thinking about it, I guess, from a different angle.
Right. Yeah. It's just, now, one of the things that you say that, again, a little more controversial, I guess, in the anti-PUFA world, which is a small little world, but is that you're saying, hey, watch out for the monounsaturated fat, and perhaps we need to even take dietary interventions to try to reverse our mechanism in our body that tends to preferentially take fat and turn it into unsaturated fat, including monounsaturated fat. How could that be a problem if I'm wrong, correct me, but most animals that we eat are going to have mostly monounsaturated fat, and then our body wants to preferentially switch saturated fat into monounsaturated fat when we're eating it. So why do we need to mess with that? If that's what we have evolved to have, why tinker with that? I mean, aren't you playing with fire here? Fire in a bottle.
Well, I like to play with fire. Well, so, all right, if we look at beef fat, for instance, it's roughly equal amounts of saturated and monounsaturated fat. In steak fat, it's a little more monounsaturated than saturated, but it's pretty close. You know, it might be 42% saturated and 45% saturated and 48% monounsaturated, but it's close to 50-50. And if you look at stored human fat, most Americans are significantly higher than that. So we might have 55% monounsaturated fat and only 30% saturated fat. And that's changed. That's true now. That was not true in 1960.
What was it in 1960? Do you know?
In 1960, it was closer to like probably 40% saturated and maybe, you know, I don't know, 48 or something percent monounsaturated. And so the level, the saturation.
So 88% of the body fat of Americans, or who was this in 1960?
Americans. So Americans in 1960, I would say 40% of our body fat was, if you looked in our fat cells, in our adipose tissue, and you analyze the fat composition, probably 40% of our fat was saturated I'm referencing a study that was done in a town in rural Indiana it was published in 1962. And it's on my blog. I think it's.
Did they have a peculiar diet that was different from the average American?
No, they were just eating the normal American diet in 1962. But vegetable oils weren't incredibly prevalent at that time. They were presumably eating meat and potatoes and apple pie, I assume, but who knows? They didn't do a dietary study along with it. And so, anyways, they were like 40% saturated. If you look at an American now, it's probably 30%. And what is increased, both the polyunsaturated fats and the monounsaturated fats have dramatically increased between 1960 and 1990. And I'm sure it's gotten worse since then. That was the last paper I really looked at was 1991.
Now, I've heard that some babies are born with 40% polyunsaturated fat. Is that right?
That is insane if it's true.
Somebody said that.
It's possible. I mean, it's possibly true. And if you look at
that means they're almost half plant.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at
studies, entity, it's like a half plant human.
If you look at studies from the 1960s, newborn babies, their fat is like 55% saturated, and then it drops from there. But there's one study where I think they looked at like premature babies, and I'd have to look at the number, but it was like 60 or 65% saturated in premature newborn babies, and then it steadily drops to adulthood, perhaps 40 to 45%, and in modern Americans maybe 30%. So it's there's been a clear downward trend in the saturation level of our fat over the past 60 years. That's very clear, I think, in the literature.
And so you're saying you don't want to demonize monounsaturated fat, but you're saying we do need to maybe see if we can increase our stored saturated fat a little bit by 10% or a little bit there.
Right. Yes. That's what I think. Well,
you're not trying to scare people. Monounsaturated fat is just as bad as PUFA. We want to make that clear.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying what really is probably important ultimately is the average, I like to say the octane of our stored body fat, right? It's like all fat is a blend of saturated fat and monounsaturated fat and polyunsaturated fat. Over the past 60 years, we've shifted to a blend that is really unsaturated, and it's both because of polyunsaturated fat, which probably initiated it, but then after that happened, we ramped up our production of monounsaturated fats. And I'm not talking about dietary we have inbuilt mechanisms to, if we eat monounsaturated fat, we have a whole enzyme system that kicks in to actually saturate it before we store it, because the body knows, okay, don't store monounsaturated fat. That's very bad to do that.
So our body converts dietary consumption of monounsaturated fat into saturated fat?
Yes, there's an enzyme there's a hormone called OAE, which the gut makes from olive oil, and what it does is it increases all of these systems, and I don't think it directly turns the monounsaturated fat into saturated fat, but what it does is it increases production of saturated fat, and it increases fat burning, and it kind of like cycles through everything. So it's like, let's burn off some of this monounsaturated fat, and also let's make a bunch of saturated fat to get it more saturated so that we can safely store it. That's what happens when we eat monounsaturated fat.
But yeah, okay. But it wants to store some of it, right? Obviously.
Yeah, I mean, it wants to store some of it.
Is it in 1962 American, when they had, was it 40% you said for monounsaturated? Was it stored?
Yeah, somewhere around there.
It had to, but it would have preferred to have 60%, 70% saturated fat in the body, or no? I mean, like, that's what I'm trying to.
I mean, yeah. So the highest
in the perfect state of nature.
Well, yeah, and so we don't unfortunately have, like, I would love to see, adipose tissue from all different all different kinds of people in the world. But right, unfortunately,
like Neanderthals. What were Neanderthals?
Sure, I would love to know that, but I don't know that. I've never seen that. It's possible that someone has done that paper and I just don't know about it. But like, yeah, no, I'd love to know those questions. I don't know the answer. I can say that, ironically, the people with the most saturated body fat tend to be starch eating cultures. So when you look at the people in the China health study, they have much more saturated body fat than Americans do, and they also seem to have very high metabolic rates. And that works.
Rice or potatoes?
They're eating white rice. Parts of the country, they're eating sweet potatoes. In the north of the country, they're eating wheat noodles. So it depends on where you are in China, but all of them are eating 85% of calories as starch. And that works for them because they're not torpid, right? They're making saturated fat and they're storing it as saturated fat. And when you look at them, they have a very high amount of stearic acid, stearic acid is interesting because it's rapidly converted to oleic acid. So there's two different main saturated fats, and one of them is palmitic acid, which is 16 carbons long, and that can be converted by SCD1 over to palmitoleic acid. But it doesn't do it at a super high frequency. So you're always going to have 10 times as much palmitoleic acid as you're going to have, palmitic acid as palmitoleic acid. But with stearic acid and oleic acid, stearic acid is converted much more efficiently to oleic acid.
And so how are the Chinese getting stearic acid from the consumption of starches and wheat noodles?
So when you eat starch, everyone has to have some body fat. And so when you eat starch, you are forced to make your body fat from the starch in your diet. And humans can only make saturated fat through the process of de novo lipogenesis. The first step in making fat is palmitic acid, which is a 16 carbon saturated fat. And then if we want to, we can elongate it into stearic acid, or we can desaturate it into oleic acid. But what we can't do is we cannot make polyunsaturated fats.
What would be the survival mechanism of elongating it to stearic acid once you've consumed the starch?
Well, I mean, so we always have some amount of all of these circulating enzymes. And so what the body's trying to do, the body wants a certain membrane fluidity. It wants certain, and a problem with saturated fat is a triglyceride that's all palmitic or stearic acid has a melting point of like 160 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's literally like hard candle wax at body temperature. And so, we can't live with pure saturated fat. And so we always have a certain amount of these elongases and these desaturases, because what they're doing is it's like, okay, let's take a third of this palmitic acid and let's extend it into stearic acid, and then let's convert half of that stearic acid into oleic acid. And what that does is it means that, fat is stored as a triglyceride, which just means it's basically 3 fat molecules hooked together. And so if you have one molecule of stearic acid and 1 molecule of palmitic acid and 1 molecule of oleic acid, right? So now you have like 48 carbons in those 3 fat molecules and only a single double bond. So that's very highly saturated, but it's also unsaturated enough to be soluble in an animal with a body temperature of 98.6 degrees or whatever. And so that's kind of what the body's trying to get to, is to have just enough monounsaturated.
What does the word soluble mean in this case?
Well, soluble, yeah, I don't even really mean soluble. What I mean is fluid. It's like the difference between a stick of butter in the refrigerator and soybean oil in the refrigerator, right? Soybean oil, butter can be rock hard in the refrigerator. Soybean oil is still a liquid, but you put that butter on the counter, butter is 30% monounsaturated. And if you put the butter on a counter on a hot summer day, it melts, right? And so think about, butter is actually a really good example. It's about maybe 60% saturated and 30 or 40% monounsaturated and just a tiny amount of PUFA. And at 98 degrees, butter is pretty much a liquid. And so that's kind of what your body wants, is for your fat.
Our body wants to be butter.
Yes, that's pretty accurate.
Want to be 60% saturated fat, 30 to 40% monounsaturated with a little bit of PUFA, like a butter is, like a stick of butter?
Probably. I mean, maybe not quite that.
Is that why butter is literally the most like satiating oil? I mean, it is. I mean, think about it.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean,
Nobody wants coconut oil rice as much as they want grass-fed butter-soaked rice. You know what I mean?
Totally. No, that's true. That's true. I mean, butter tastes really good. For some reason, we are attracted to the flavor of butyrate, which is what butter is named after. It's a little short 4-carbon saturated fat. And so in some ways, butter is a bad example of what I'm talking about, because these little short chain fats, which are like also in MCT oil, butter has a lot of these shorter chain fats. And so it's a little more liquid than if it were all long chain fats would be at the same amount of saturation level, but whatever. I mean, the same thing's true of like beef fat, you know. Beef fat is probably a better example of what our bodies should be. We should be like, you know, similar to, I would say, what beef fat is, which is, you know, probably 40 to 45% saturated would be perfect. And that's exactly what you see, interestingly, in healthy, i.e. non-torpid, starch-eating cultures. And the problem is, if you have this torpid metabolism and you start eating a bunch of starch, now your metabolism is in this mode of like, okay, we're going to take all this starch and we're going to convert it to fat and we're going to store it because we think winter's coming on and we're trying to fatten up for winter because we're torpid, you know. I think that's ultimately the difference. I think that's ultimately why, right. And that's why Chinese cultures can eat white rice, nothing but white rice, and stay thin. And an obese American, that doesn't work so well, right? Because because the Chinese don't have as much torpidity or whatever torpor passed on generationally, right? Right, exactly. And like I said, once you get into it, it's hard to get out of it. And so that's, I think that accounts for a lot of the genetic differences between, we have more lipogenic genes being expressed. That's another way of saying we're torpid, but lipogenic meaning fat making. All of these things that I'm talking about, the PPAR gamma and the SCD1, they're all fatty acid synthase. They're all genes that make and store fat. And that's
white sugar. Does white sugar turn into saturated fat like starches do, or not as efficiently?
So that's actually a really good question. So sugar, at least in large amounts, massively upregulates SCD1. So
is that how Ray Pete's losing all that weight with, or these people are losing weight with Ray Pete's thing, drinking the hell out of orange juice and ice cream?
Well, I don't know about that. I'll throw another anecdote in there. No, I don't believe that eating a lot of sugar is a great idea. And I'll throw an anecdote in there. So this is another Native American one, but so in my part of the world, Native Americans made a lot of maple sugar. And there in the 1700s, someone said, the Native Americans in the winter, they eat their main food source. This is kind of mind blowing, is like basically equal amounts of bear fat and maple sugar. And then they would roast venison and dip the roasted venison into the sugar and bear fat. Lord, I know it sounds great. And that's how they live, so like February and March.
They were making their own little glaze,
Exactly. And that's how they live through the late winter. But what they also said was some Native Americans grow so fond of the maple sugar that they live entirely on maple sugar. And those are the only fat Indians we've seen. And so it seems that even living a traditional life, if you eat too many of your calories as pure sugar, you can increase your levels of SCD1 and probably PPAR gamma and all the others to become torpid and then obese just by eating enough sugar. So starch doesn't do that same thing. So my point being that sugar upregulates those enzymes much more so than starch does.
Operates the enzymes that converts the food into
fat. the
monounsaturated fat, right?
exactly, the lipogenic enzyme.
But how does sugar itself get stored? Can it get stored as monounsaturated fat too, or only does it?
Yes, it's going to, any fat that is made by a human is going to be a combination of saturated and monounsaturated fats. It's just a question of the proportion. What proportion of them is saturated versus what proportion is monounsaturated? And I would argue that if you're eating tons and tons of sugar, you know, and you can easily demonstrate this in, you know, not everyone loves mice studies, but you can easily show in mice that if you feed them all sugar, they make a lot more SCD1 and their fat gets a lot more unsaturated. And then you can see the same thing happening in humans.
Is it because their genetics though have carried on a torpid state?
I don't think it's genetics. I think any human can probably pull. I think any human, if you just drink, if you eat, I mean, I don't know about the rapey people drinking orange juice. That's an example I haven't looked into, but I think some amount of sugar. You know, the in mice studies,
they avoid starches and they eat orange juice and like mangoes and ice cream and.
Yeah, I mean, ice cream is, you know, I don't know. I'm not sure like what the percentage in the mouse studies where they showed massively upregulated SCD1, they were giving them like 90% of their calories as like straight up white sugar. Okay. And the Native Americans, of course, were getting 100% of their calories from sugar. So that may be I'm not sure where that breakpoint is. Like maybe you can get 50% of your calories as sugar and be fine. I'm not sure. I know that 90% is probably too much.
So that's what I'm trying to get at, though, for the broader picture of the obesity problem in America. A lot of people point to sugar. I've been in the low carb keto world for a while now. And so I've only recently started investigating the omega-6 phenomenon as the primary driver of obesity. But still, some would say, hey, no, look, with your thought experiment, David, that you suggested, if you removed all the seed oils from the last century, 2021 to 1921, but you kept all the rates of sugar, we'd still have a big problem with obesity. But I think you would say no, probably not to the extent we have today.
I would say not nearly to the same extent. And I would also say that, you know, I believe that upregulation of these lipogenic genes is the shared mechanism by which both vegetable oil and sugar can cause obesity. And I think that of the two, the vegetable oil, the linoleic acid, is a stronger upregulator of these lipogenic genes in this torpor pattern than is sugar. But they both are upregulating, you know, PPAR gamma and SCD1 and all the same players, right? They're both functioning on that same. And just to also bring it back to leptin again. Okay, so what's the alternative? I keep talking about, okay, well, we'll run this one leg of this metabolic pathway with lipogenic genes and PPAR gamma and SCD1. Okay, well, what's the alternative option? Well, leptin downregulates PPAR gamma and it upregulates something called PPAR alpha. And I have this little joke in my head. I don't know if you remember that. There's a Christmas cartoon with the heat miser and the cold miser, and they're like Mother Nature's sons, and one of them wants a green Christmas and one of them wants a white Christmas, because this is all related to like body temperature or whatever. So in my head, PPAR alpha is played by the heat miser and PPAR gamma is played by the cold miser, and they're like battling it out over your metabolic rate. And so leptin is, so PPAR alpha they call the master regulator of fat burning, and PPAR gamma is like the master regulator of fat storing, and linoleic acid is upregulating the PPAR gamma, so we store fat, and leptin is upregulating PPAR alpha so that we burn fat. And just to throw one more thing into this along these lines, so the other thing that leptin does is it specifically downregulates SCD1, and something that insulin does is it upregulates SCD1. So leptin and insulin are in this battle over the level of this enzyme that converts monounsaturated fat to monounsaturated fat, right? So if we're arguing,
it converts what to what?
Saturated fat to monounsaturated fat. So if I'm correct that the level of saturation of our fat is a key controller of our metabolic rate, and therefore whether or not we store or versus burn fat, the key enzyme doing that is this SCD1, and leptin and insulin are battling over the levels of this SCD1, and therefore how saturated your fat's going to be. So if you have a lot of insulin, it's trying to make your fat less saturated. When leptin comes around, it's trying to make your fat more saturated, and this whole like game is playing out with the heat miser and the cold miser and all the things.
And so we come to the solution here, because we've talked a lot about the problem and observations, not just of the problem, but just general observations of what's going on here with torpor, your hypothesis. So if that's the case, let's give your solution for not just so we can give a solution for the average person who's not going to really want to change significantly. This is a good general direction. And then let's give the nerd solution for the folks who are like, I'm ready, sign me up. And again, we're not giving anybody medical advice or any dietary advice. We're just talking about personal observations of things that you can change in your diet or whatever to try to saturate more of your fat, right?
Right, totally. Yeah, and so the most obvious thing is to eliminate sources of polyunsaturated fat. A lot of them are obvious. A lot of them are more subtle. Like, okay, so obviously you don't want to buy soybean oil and eat it and keep it in your house. But this also means, think about it. Okay, you go to the diner and you order eggs thinking like, well, eggs are a pretty safe choice. But what does the diner cook the eggs in? Probably vegetable oil, right? And so you have to think about, especially if you're eating out, that's another hidden source. Like anything you buy at a restaurant is probably cooked in vegetable oil, unless it's like cooked on a charbroiler.
Ironically, I believe McDonald's beef patties, if you just order them by themselves, I don't think they hit a grill. I may be wrong on
They
that.
might not. I don't know.
I think they heat them in a little warmer or something.
It's like a microwavey kind of device, probably. Yeah.
So, or Wendy's. I mean, I don't see that are they putting them on the grill? Maybe they are. Burger King. I don't know.
I'm not sure. I know Burger King advertises their flame broiled Whopper, but I don't know if that's really true.
Do you think they spray soybean oil, Pam type spray on the broiler, or what's going on there?
Well, I don't know. Usually the broiler is like, if it's a good charbroiler, usually you don't have to, but I don't know I can't say what all the different restaurants do, but restaurant food is a hidden source.
We're trying to create a survival guide for Americans in a torpid, insane world, so we have to
navigate totally
this carefully.
And then obviously, any packaged foods at a grocery store are all full of vegetable oil,
not like shredded cheese, though. Let's be clear. Some packaged
not like shredded cheese, right? No, there are some things that are not like cheese is not full of vegetable oil. And there's weird ones. It's like, just to put a really strange example into the world. I'm kind of a closet like gummy bear addict. I love gummy bears, and I will like cheat with a bag of gummy bears. But the problem with gummy bears is they stick together when they come off the production line or whatever. So often they'll like toss them in like canola oil to keep them from sticking to each other. So these vegetable oils sneak in like all kinds of crazy places that you would never even think of. So that's one, is the vegetable oils. Two is like get the right. Don't eat things that eat vegetable oils. And that's where we start thinking about polyunsaturated fat in pork, polyunsaturated fat in chicken. And, shameless plug, I am selling low PUFA pork at Firebrand Meats, which is fed with a special diet that is like, I've eliminated almost all of the polyunsaturated fat from the diets that I'm feeding them. So this is good old fashioned pork with like saturated fat and not polyunsaturated fat.
And you're not a sponsor, but I have tried your product and I have to say it's very good. Very good.
Thank you. Yeah, and so that's one, and then also egg yolks are can be surprisingly high in polyunsaturated fat. It's not, most people are not eating a ton of egg yolks, but I think it's similar to the
20%,
chicken.
30%
of the fat in the egg yolks. Yeah, I think it's usually 20 to 30% PUFA.
That's a lot.
I know, because we feed chickens all of this supplemental soybean oil. Because
what about because people are going to ask, because when they hear, okay, avoid the PUFA heavy eggs, they automatically think, okay, that means pasture raised, cage free organic chicken eggs are good to go. But you're saying no, that's not correct, possibly.
Right. And so, so we talked about this a little offline yesterday, but so one of the problems that we have is that, so soybean meal happens to, and this is one of the things that got us into this whole problem in the first place, is it just so happens that soybean meal is a really good source of protein to grow monogastric animals like pigs and chickens, right? And they realized this in like the 40s and 50s, even before that a little bit. And we started growing all of these soybeans to feed to animals, and soybeans are about 20% oil. And they realized very early on, like, oh, if we feed these whole beans, these whole soybeans to pigs, their fat gets really greasy, right? It gets full of PUFA, and then the manufacturers were having a hard time like slicing bacon because the bacon was so soft and greasy, and so they very quickly realized, like, okay, if we want this soy protein to grow the pigs, but we need to get the oil out. And so, you know, they built these huge factories, right, that takes the soybean oil out of the soybean meal, and then the soybean meal, which is the soy protein, goes to the animals, and then they decided to feed the soybean oil to us, right? That's what happened. And so now we eat the soybean oil, and the animals get the soy.
Now, if you cut us up and slice our bacon, it's too greasy to cut.
Right, we would make very greasy bacon, exactly. And so, where am I going with this? Right, and so the end result of this is that if you're buying commercial, regular, genetically modified soybean meal, it's actually very low in oil because it goes to these big refineries that remove all the oil from it. And so, if you were to raise a pig on that soybean oil, or a chicken, I guess we were talking about, on like regular corn and soy feed, corn itself is fairly oily. And so, you know, corn and soy meal still makes a somewhat oily meat. However, if you go to organic, they're probably growing their beans locally. They're probably getting roasted locally. And there's probably no big factory locally that can remove the 20% of oil out of the soybeans. And so most organic feed mills that I've ever been to use whole roasted soybeans, and they grind them up and they put it in the chicken feed. And like I say, that's a substantial amount of polyunsaturated fat. So organic chicken. So to recap, organic chicken, eggs, and meat, and organic pork could have more PUFA than they might have more than the stuff in the grocery store. Unfortunately, wow. I don't like to be the bearer of that bad news, but that's what important. It is. And I've dealt with I know the operators of the local organic feed mill, and they're very nice people. And, I don't want to talk bad about them. And I love the idea of local agriculture and being self-sufficient and growing our own stuff locally. But you also have to understand that creates other problems that we haven't thought about.
So how do these conventional factory chicken and pork have so much PUFA in them if they are feeding them just the protein isolated from the fat?
Well, and so feed mills, we talked about this a little bit offline yesterday too, but so feed mills are going to want to, if they're going to say, okay, if they're going to get behind, this is my mill and this is my chicken feed, this is my main blended chicken feed that I sell, they're going to go talk to a certified livestock nutritionist that went to Ohio State or one of the other big ag universities, right? And they discovered back in a long time ago, that if you feed a little bit of, so you take the soybean, you take the soybeans, you remove all the oil, now you have the meal, right? And now you're feeding the corn and the soybeans to the chickens. Well, they discovered that, if they gave them full fat soybean oil or full fat soybeans, that was too oily and too greasy. But if you take like 5% of their diet and you make 5% of their diet soybean oil, that made the chickens grow faster, right? And so since the 60s, it has been it has been, if you ask any livestock nutritionist, they're like, oh yeah, chicken feeds need to be supplemented with soybean oil. You have to put 5% soybean oil in them. And so every layer feed, like for egg laying chickens, every broiler for meat chickens, they all have, you know, any feed mill, whether it's a local feed mill, whether it's a huge feed mill, they're all going to talk to the nutritionist, and the nutritionists are going to tell them you have to add 5% oil to any chicken diet, or 10% or 8% or whatever percentage they use.
Corn oil too?
It could be corn. It could be any oil.
I was telling you about the one place where they said no soy, no corn, but they were loaded in sunflower oil, which is a little linoleic acid heavy than the other two. Apparently.
Right, exactly. And so that's often what happens now is people will, well, I want to say corn and soy free, and then the nutritionist will say, well, to get the energy level right, put sunflowers in it or sunflower seed oil. And you're like, well, now you're still adding just as much PUFA.
By the way, just off topic for a second, sunflower oil is a highly consumed oil in Russia, and they have a lower life expectancy that may be associated with that. You know what I mean? Since it's such a high linoleic acid, and they use it for everything, you know?
Yeah, true.
Just interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's give our A+ student, the one who wants to be the overachiever, to try to reverse the torpid state. You've got rid of all the omega-6s in your life. You're not eating out recklessly anymore. When you go to a restaurant, you have to be the jerk who says, I need it cooked in butter or coconut oil because I'm allergic to anything else. You know, you have to, if you're going to do the restaurant thing, that's probably the only way to survive it a lot of times. But what are you eating? And other than that, and what are you doing? You know, are you, I know you have some things like sterculia, but before we get to that, are you megadosing golden seal? Again, we're not telling people what to do. We're just talking the person.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things. You know, I've been dosing with something called stearic acid, which we've talked a lot. It's the 18 carbon fat. And so, you know, there's some natural foods out there that are really high in stearic acid. One of them is beef suet, which is specifically the kidney fat of a cow. And it's not that easy to find sometimes. And
does it have to be cow, or can it be rabbit kidney, for example?
It can be any ruminant, I think, is going to be very high in stearic acid. So it could be bison, it could be lamb, it could be goat, it could be cow. But I think I would stick to a ruminant for if what you're really after is a high proportion of stearic acid. And so that's a thing that I use. And I like, you know, I don't totally avoid starches. I have a recipe on my website for fat bomb fries, which is like basically these fries made in beef suet, and you like fry them once and then you soak them in the suet and they absorb more suet. So at the end of the day, they're French fries, but it's like 70% of the calories are from beef suet.
How many can you eat before you're full? 4?
Not that many. Not as many as you would think.
Would they fit in a small McDonald's fry bag?
Probably. Yeah. No, for sure. Like the old fashioned bag. Yeah. You know, I've been doing like timers. I usually eat like one big meal a day. And so I can pack away a few. Is that
because you're intentionally doing intermittent fasting as a weight loss thing, or no?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like the intermittent fasting works for me. You know, one is, I don't know, I get sleepy after a meal. So I like to not eat anything before like 4 o'clock in the afternoon, because I feel like it makes me more productive. And then I just eat a big meal and then I'm good after that. So I've been doing, I sort of fell off the bandwagon the last month, and I got super anyways, I had a whole bunch of things happen. So I haven't been very.
You binge on the PUFA or sugar? What messes you up? I'm not saying binge like intentionally. I'm saying just like what messes.
It's all over the place. I don't mind. What messes me up is things like being like, I was traveling and I was at my mom's house, and I feel like when I get out of my
routine, right?
When I get out of my routine, I'm more likely to binge, and I will keep to like pretty similar things that I would eat anyways when I binge, but it's just like I just eat more because I'm like out and I'm tired and I don't sleep well, and that's another thing is if I don't sleep well, makes me I'm hungrier. But so now, you know,
PUFA should make you sleep well since they're all about torpid.
Well, that's true. But I avoid those. So I still, anyway, I've always had sleep issues, but so yeah. And there's another thing. So one of the things that people on my website love is there's this paper with this, I call it the banana milkshake paper, but they took people and they put them on a zero fat vegan diet for 2 days, and they showed that their mitochondria actually separate, and they all become distinct floating around in the cell, just these little isolated mitochondria. And then they gave them this shake, which had like 25 grams of pure stearic acid with like, bananas and milk all blended together. And they drank that, and they showed that within 5 or 6 hours, their mitochondria all fused together into these like big networks of mitochondria. And it's a beautiful study because they stained them and they put them on an electron microscope. And so you can actually see, it's a very visual paper. You can see all these mitochondria fused together in these networks. And they showed that eating that much stearic acid all in one dose actually increased the rate at which people's bodies were burning fat. And part of that process was the mitochondrial fusion, which is interesting. It's kind of like anecdotal, but it's pretty neat.
How do we know that fusion is a good thing for the mitochondria?
Well, because they did another thing showing that, the circulating, when the mitochondria fused, they showed that the circulating long chain fats in the blood also dropped, suggesting that the cells were taking up and burning these long chain fats. And they have a couple other indicators that, I think they did a fairly good job of arguing that, in fact, the mitochondria were burning a lot more fat in this fused mode than they had been the hour before they ate the milkshake. And so that's something that people have been having good results with.
So if someone wants to get super serious, what do they eat? I mean, to have a good life without being, we don't want them to be, eating the most miserable diet in the world, but what's a very healthy A+, you're doing a good job if you really want to get rid of this torpor problem as we land the plane here?
Sure. I mean, I think that, it's going to vary a lot by individual. Like I say, I was doing the fat bomb fries to increase my stearic acid level. Not everyone is going to want to eat starch, right? And so I think,
is
but as a
inhibitor to the problem, like if you're eating a fat bomb ribeye every day, is that better than eating a fat bomb plate of fries? Or I'm talking about from a nutritional need standpoint and a weight loss standpoint and a getting out of torpor standpoint.
Sure. I tend to find, like, for me personally, I find if I have not a huge amount, but if I have a little starch in a meal, I guess it gets my blood sugar up. I feel more satisfied hours after the meal. That might just be me. That might not be true of everybody, but I find that that's a thing that happens. So I like it. I like a little starch for that reason. But at the same time, lots of people follow my blog and they remain pure keto, and they've done things to increase, like, if I've got some testimonials listed on the blog, and you can look at those and see what different people have done. But like, one woman started, another really high source of stearic acid is cocoa butter. Like you say, it's the tropical oils are the ones that are very saturated. And so she started getting discs of cocoa butter and like melting them in her coffee this morning. And she's in the morning, and she said she got tremendous satiation throughout the day by just having a little cocoa butter in the morning. Another thing people have done is I have this product that's like stearic acid enhanced butter oil, right? It starts as butter, but then it's like 20% stearic acid on top of the butter. And like, people can make a simple like pan sauce for a steak where you like grill the steak, and then you add a little bit of that stearic acid enhanced butter oil, and you can deglaze it with a little water, or put a little water or wine in the pan, and kind of just whisk that into a quick sauce and pour that over the steak. That's another thing people like to do from a low carb setting. And if you just really want to consume,
can you put stearic acid into red wine, the powder, and then just mix it up and use it as a glaze, or does it work?
Well, it's in the pan. When the pan's hot, if you look up a recipe for a simple pan sauce for a steak, it's typically, sometimes you use mustard to help emulsify it, but you just you take the steak out, you've got the brown bits on the bottom of the pan. This is like a traditional French thing, or like what you get in a bistro. You add a little butter, you melt that, you add a little bit of liquid. The liquid helps get the caramelized stuff to melt off the bottom of the pan, and then it all just melts together, and that's your steak sauce. And you can add a little mustard in there that helps it keep together as a sauce.
So you need to make Fire in a Bottle cooking show. You gonna do that next?
I might do that. Yeah,
it'd be fun. Seriously, you should do that.
No, it would
make
be
it fun for people, to see.
Yeah, well, and I've been playing around with another thing that I've been playing around that's really good is, so one of the problems with the stearic acid is like I said before, it has a melting point of like 170 degrees. So like if you were to melt straight stearic acid into your coffee and then try to drink it like that, it literally just like turns to wax in your mouth and like sticks to your teeth. So you have to that's why I mix it with the butter, is to make it, the butter brings down the melting point.
What about me? I was ridiculously eating raw suet. I would just bite off a piece of raw suet and eat it. And I would also eat raw, cocoa butter. Is that a counterintuitive thing to do? You need to heat it?
No, there's nothing wrong with that. The only reason that I'm heating it is because
it's very Germanic and very brutish to just eat raw chunks of fat that's raw, but does that does it enhance the effectiveness of the stearic acid by heating it, or is it pure?
I don't know that it advances so my concern is this. My concern is that the stearic acid, it's pretty fine. The stuff that I have is like food grade 92% pure stearic acid, and it's a fine powder. But the problem with it is that the melting point is so high. I'm not sure how well it's absorbed by the body, because I don't know that it dissolves. A lot of it might just pass right through people. And so that's why I say, is that a problem
with eating raw suet or
no, because raw suet is, when this is the same thing with cocoa butter. When I talked about the triglycerides, and I said that if you have a triglyceride, aka 3 fats stuck together, and like one of them is stearic acid saturated, one of them is palmitic acid saturated, and one of them is like oleic monounsaturated fat together, that molecule is basically what beef suet and cocoa butter are made of. They're like 1/3 stearic acid, 1/3 palmitic acid, 1/3 oleic acid, and those triglycerides will melt in your mouth. So you don't have the issue with those of them being like really hard. And so the reason that I heat the stearic acid up and mix them into things is to try to make them more digestible. Although having said that, some people, the banana milkshake experiment, they didn't do that. They just added it to the blender with the banana and blended it up and drank it. And some people have said, yeah, I just put the powder in water and chug it like that. And I'm seeing results, in terms of like increased body temperature, etc.
So raw cocoa butter would probably pass through you without being digested, but
no. I think the raw cocoa butter would be digested just fine, because the raw cocoa butter is just like the suet. It's got a little bit of monounsaturated fat in it, and that just makes it melt at body temperature. So cocoa butter is, when they say the old commercial, melts in your mouth, not in your hand, I think for M&Ms, because cocoa butter is that. It's very hard at room temperature, but it will melt in your mouth. And the same thing is true of suet, but the pure stearic acid will not melt in your mouth. Wow. It's actually quite hard. And so that's why I mix it with butter, or I, add a little mustard to help emulsify it. And one of the things I found recently that's actually really great is a little bit of xanthan gum really goes a long way towards getting that stearic acid kind of like mixed together. So if I take a little bit of like cream, I'll put a little xanthan gum in there and then add a bunch of stearic acid to that and heat it all up and stir it together. And now it's like, now it's really good. So,
and then what do you do with that? That's a sauce?
Well, the other day I made it into ice cream. But you could also do it like it's fantastic. It's fantastic.
Stearic acid infused ice cream.
That's right.
With what? Raw egg yolks or something, or what?
I didn't use egg yolks. I just did, vanilla bean and the cream and a little milk and a lot of stearic acid and the xanthan gum, and I think I used a little like brown sugar.
And did you say you lost like 4 pant sizes in a month or something? What was that?
When I first started doing the croissant diet, the result of megadosing the stearic acid was crazy. I dropped like 4 inches off my waist in just a couple of weeks. And I well, I have some articles on my blog on the upcoming weeks about I've thought a lot more about the dynamics of why the differences between dietary fats and stored body fats, right? Because whenever we're burning fat, we're burning a mixture of our recently consumed dietary fat and our stored body fat. And so it's just the thing I've been thinking a lot about recently in the dynamics. And I just found an interesting paper from the 60s. So that'll be an upcoming article.
Is there any health downsides to that are hypothetically possible with eating too much stearic acid like you're doing?
I mean, not that I've seen. Most studies suggest that stearic acid is pretty good in terms of like blood glucose control and other things. Like it has it's a pretty healthy track record if you look in the literature. So I haven't seen anything that, really makes me concerned. But
and how does the stearic acid eliminate it doesn't eliminate monounsaturated or PUFA fat, right?
No, it doesn't. What it does is it increases the octane of the fuel, right? That's going into your mitochondria, which is where the fat is actually burned.
So it's energizing your cells so that they can burn off the excess PUFA and monounsaturated fat.
Right. I think what it's doing is it's causing this mitochondrial fusion. It's increasing the rates that we're burning fat, and that's increasing the thermogenesis, or our ability to kind of, burn off fat as heat rather than keep it stored. Wow. That's the theory.
Well, it's always fascinating talking with you, Brad. I really enjoyed this discussion, and I think we've made some progress in making sense of all of this stuff. And again, this is just early frontier thought and hypotheses, but it's certainly, you've made a compelling case to investigate these things further, and I mean, obviously this is not, we're not making grand claims about what you must do, but you've certainly made a case by connecting it to nature and everything. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, like I say, I'm thinking a lot these days about just that. Well, exactly what I was talking about. It's like, okay, there's the diet that's fairly easy to control, and then there's your stored body fat, and that's a little bit harder, right? And I wrote an article called the SCD1 Theory of Obesity Part 2, and it's like what you can do about it. There's all kinds of different things. There are all kinds of like herbal things that you can do on the market to like help suppress some of these lipogenic things. One of them, which is actually very well known, is I'm spacing on the name now. It's a popular diabetes drug that seems to actually help.
Metformin?
Metformin, right. Metformin is a potent downregulator of SCD1 and the lipogenic genes. And there's something called berberine, which is sort of an herbal version of metformin that kind of does the same thing. And that can help suppress your level of this SCD1 and the lipogenic genes. There's also a type of tea, and this was actually pointed out to me by one of the readers of the blog, called Pu-erh tea. It's like Pu-erh, which is like a fermented green tea that also suppresses SCD1 and some of these things. And so there's a variety of things you can take, and you referenced it before. I had this thing imported called sterculic oil, which is like a tropical oil that actually directly inhibits the SCD1 protein itself after it's produced, which is different from some of the herbal things that prevent it being produced in the first place. And so, yeah, there's a lot of different things.
Sterculic oil as a native food in that area or wherever that's.
They do. So
at the level that you're eating it, or no? Like, is it something?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so I've been eating only like a couple hundred milligrams a day, and so the oil, these nuts grow in tropical areas, and they sell them. Like if you go to a farmer's market in India, you can buy these sterculic seeds, and the seeds
don't have PUFA on them like other seeds do.
They don't. They're mostly palmitic acid and this sterculic oil, which is it's almost like a saturated fat, but it has this like ring structure that actually where the CD1 enzyme tries to do its thing and it actually blocks it. But yeah, no, they eat them as like street food. And
why would that have happened in nature?
I don't know. I
mean?
think
Like
I know it's a weird coincidence, and I don't really have a theory for why. I don't have a theory for why that is.
They're in the tropics only.
It's tropical tree.
That's there are a high saturated fat seed, right, or nut.
Right, exactly. That's why it's mostly saturated fat, and the ring structure in the sterculic oil makes it so the fats don't pack as tightly together. So it's actually a liquid. So you take it out and you're like, oh, this seems like vegetable oil, but it's not. It's just that it has this extra ring structure that prevents it from the fats from packing together as tightly. So
is it related to cocoa butter? No,
it's not related to cocoa butter. It's its own family of tree. There are some other things that actually, for instance, even cottonseed oil contains a tiny amount of this sterculic acid. It's only like 1% or less, or 0.5% or something like that. But a lot of dairy, so a lot of bacteria also make this sterculic acid. So
dairy, what was that? What makes sterculic acid again?
A lot of bacteria.
So dairy, raw cheeses have a lot of it in it?
So yeah, what happens is if cows are fed silage, so silage is a fermented, it's like fermented grass or fermented corn. And so if you drive around the Northeast and you go by dairy farms, you'll see these like huge mounds of plastic, and they're usually covered in tires. And what those are they're basically giant piles of sauerkraut. And they're feeding the sauerkraut to the cows. And it's a lot in the Northeast. It rains all the time this summer, so it's really hard to make hay because the hay has to lay out for like 3 days and dry without rain, which is very difficult to get 3 days in May where it doesn't rain. So what they do is they make silage, because you take it wet and you just pack it into these mountains and you cover it with plastic and it stays all year like that. So almost no dairy farms make hay, they make silage. And the silage, because it's fermented, of course, has all these bacteria and organisms in it, and those organisms make some of the sterculic oil. So when you look at dairy products, they often have some amount of this sterculic acid. The oil that I have is just like the most potent thing of it, that you know what I mean. But there are other minor sources. Even durian fruit, which is the weird kind of like fruit.
It's very tasty, very good.
I've never actually eaten it, but the seed of durian fruit, which is edible, also contains 10 or 15% of the sterculic oil. So there's a lot of things that are
typically, just to play devil's advocate for a second, and we gotta wrap it up here, but I just can't help myself. So, but typically you're not supposed to eat seeds, right? Maybe, plants don't want you to eat their seeds. So they put stuff in there to be toxic. So what's the fluke here? You know what I mean? Like what if we eat too much of this seed oil and then it opens up a whole nother Pandora's box of hell for the next century?
Well, that could be. And like I say, I like to experiment, and I like to try things. And I'm not a big fan of the word toxins, because I feel like that's a very non-specific thing.
Sure.
It's like I'm like, yeah, I mean, maybe they do, but I mean, they do make all kinds of things.
They don't want their seeds to be eaten. So why would this be so upside and no downside? You know what I mean?
Sure. No, I'm with you. And I'm not saying it's all upside. I'm just saying it's an interesting thing to try, right? It's an interesting thing in the toolbox. If I can figure out any way, because when I do so I recommend this blood test called, it's a blood test where they measure the different fats in your red blood cell membranes. And so you can see, like, okay, what's my desaturated index, right? How much of these monounsaturated fats and how much of these saturated fats do I have? And I have like huge amounts starting out of these monounsaturated fats. So my enzyme systems are clearly very dysregulated. I'm like way into this torporous metabolism. So when I look at it, I'm like, I don't know if there's a natural oil out there that can block that positive feedback loop. I'm going to give it a shot, because what I think is, what I think might happen, and I think I'm going to pre-anticipate your question of like, how long might this take? So like I say, I'm taking like 2 little dropperfuls of this a day, which I think is enough.
How many nuts would that be if you had to eat that naturally, if you're an indigenous person eating these nuts? I'm just trying to, would that be?
I'm guessing like 2 or 3. They're pretty big nuts.
Really? Okay. So it's a very oily nut. That's what I'm trying to get.
The nut is 50% oil by weight, and they're pretty big. They're like the size of like a big olive. So
okay, that makes me a lot.
Yeah, it wouldn't
about it then.
Yeah, no, it wouldn't be hard to get that much. And like I said,
think about like corn oil. 96 ears of corn makes
right. No. It's nothing
Frankenstein you're doing.
Right. No, this is basically just
this
like
is
eating a nut.
for people, I think, to hear.
Yeah,
this.
no, totally. Yeah, and so it's a very much what you could get from eating. It'd be like eating 2 or 3 nuts a day, basically.
And they just you can bite. Can you just eat the nut, or do you have to like render it to cook it if you wanted to eat it in its natural form?
No, I think they eat them raw. Like there's videos online of them. All of my experience of this nut is watching YouTube videos. So it's like, here's a market.
Indigenously, or do they eat it as fun for snack for food?
They just eat it as food. It's like here's a market vendor in India, and they've got the things open, like the seed pods open, and they're taking the seeds out, and there's like a membrane on them that they kind of peel off, and then they're white. It looks kind of like a macadamia nut, and they're just selling them.
Cooking oil out of this?
They're just well, it's not a cooking oil.
But can you make it as a cooking oil or no? Like macadamia nut oil is a cooking oil.
It doesn't taste that great, so I wouldn't recommend it as a cooking oil.
Does it taste like medicine?
No, it has it tastes a little bit like wood polish. That's the thing that it's been compared to. It's not the best.
Is that a sign that you're not supposed to eat it?
Maybe. I mean, I don't think it tastes that bad. Some people think it tastes terrible, and some people are like, I don't even taste anything. It doesn't have any flavor to me. So there's a wide array of opinions about what the actual flavor is. But yeah. So no, I think the amount I'm taking isn't a normal amount. And here's my hope and my thought is that I think the oil will shut down this positive feedback loop of torpor, but then I think it's already done that. But then once that happens, I suspect it's going to take me a year of doing this until my body fat of consuming, 1,200 milligrams of this oil a day. And I think because your body fat changes over only very slowly, right? It's like slowly day by day, it's changing a little by little by little. So I don't know, maybe it's 3 months, maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's 9 months, maybe I don't know how long it's going to take. But my goal is then if I stop taking it for a little while. So yeah, if you stop taking it for a little while, then you can I can do another blood test and maybe get a better idea of how my body fat is really changing over. And I suspect that at some point, my sincere hope is that at some point we can break out of this cycle of torpor and get back to having a kind of normal metabolism. That would be cool, right? Yeah. And I don't know if we can, but that's what I'm attempting to do. So we'll see.
Wow, that's so interesting, and I was looking at this. There's studies a little bit about it. Have you seen this? Plant oil may counter obesity-related issues.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm not the first one to have this thought.
And what have they found? Did they find anything in these studies that was interesting for humans or mice, or what was it?
I mean, in mice, it's been shown pretty clearly in mice to prevent. There's a really good study linked to, if you read on my blog, I believe it's the SCD Theory of Obesity Part 1, but it might be Part 2. There was a good study, I think it was just done in 2019 with mice or rats, I forget now. And the sterculic oil did a really good job of preventing liver fat accumulation and I think abdominal obesity in these mice that they fed a really high sugar diet to. There's a control group of mice given all of the sugar and they get really fat. And the ones given the sugar and a little bit of the sterculic oil stay a lot leaner. They have much less liver fat accumulation. They're much more insulin sensitive. They seem to have just much better overall metabolic health than the ones given just the pure sugar without the sterculic oil. So there's a lot, there's a decent amount of There's also a lot of studies. The reason that the SCD1 thing became popular in the first place is that around 2005, they showed that, so there was this strain of very fat mice, and they can't make leptin. They call them OB mice. And they can't make leptin. And this is the story I tell in the SCD1 Theory of Obesity Part 1. And it turns out that in these fat mice, they have low metabolic rate, they have low body temperature, they have all the problems. If you just delete the gene SCD1, so if they can no longer make monounsaturated fat, it reverses the whole phenotype. Their metabolic rate shoots through the roof. They become lean, and it fixes 80% of the problems caused by the lack of leptin can be reversed by then also removing SCD1, which sort of makes the argument that the main job of leptin is to suppress SCD1, right? Leptin does a handful of things, the most important of which I would argue is suppressing SCD1. And that's why a mouse lacking both leptin and SCD1 is almost as lean as a normal mouse.
So it's almost as if it's like you got a I mean, again, we're just thinking out loud here. It's almost as if you've got to go to this tropical nut and kind of dose up on it to remind your body that it's not in this cold ass frozen state of torpor all the time. It's like you've got to bring some heavy tropics.
Yeah.
for the body to be like, okay, I got it. We're obviously in a hot as hell tropical climate. No more need to be torpid, right? I mean,
that's an interesting one. I've never thought about it like that, but that's an interesting suggestion. Yeah.
So interesting. It's like our body has to have this megadose to override the generational overflow of the poof of fat that we've inherited, right? That's effed up all of our signaling to upregulate this.
Yeah. Well, and the other bit of things that we can look at in real humans is that, and maybe I already mentioned this, but humans who have a defect in their SCD1 gene, who have an SCD1 protein that's less efficient at creating monounsaturated fat, they tend to be lean.
So they don't need to take sterculic oil ever.
Right. They don't need to take sterculic oil because they already have a dysfunctional enzyme.
What is better, stearic acid or sterculic oil?
I think that if you want fast results, quick bang for the buck, the stearic acid is pretty crazy what it can do. I'm not sure though that in the long term, if you're super torpid and super dysregulated, if the stearic acid will fix the internal problems, over the course of a year or several years. And so
how do you know if you're super torpid? If you're 50 pounds overweight, what?
Well, that's a good indicator, yes. But so the best test that I know of is to do this Omega Quant Complete test. And what it does is you send them a spot of your blood, and they send you back all the different fats that are in your blood. So if you have a lot of oleic acid and not very much stearic acid, if you have a lot of palmitoleic acid and not very much palmitic acid, which is to say, if you have lots of monounsaturated fats and not many saturated fats, that is a good indicator that you are torpid, that you're dysregulated, and you're making way too much SCD1 and the other lipogenic genes. I think that's the best. Is there any
indication that if you don't have a problem with SCD1 and you take this sterculic acid like you're doing on a regular basis, that it could cause problems? Probably, right? It's possible.
I mean, it could be, and so one of the potential side effects of blocking the SCD1 is I think it could cause inflammation if you take too much of it. In the beginning, I was taking a lot of it because I wanted to see, does anything bad happen, right? And nothing really bad happened, but I did have an increase in some of the inflammatory markers.
This study I'm looking at here, I don't know if you've seen it, behavioral effect of Sterculia apetala seed oil consumption in male Zucker rats.
That's a different species. I don't know which nut that is, but
The aim of this study was to evaluate the effect of administration of sterculic oil during an 8-week period on anxiety-like behavior and spontaneous locomotor activity in Zucker rats, analyzed through light, dark, and open field tests. The results showed that the consumption of sterculic oil decreased exploration latency in light, dark tests, which suggests an anxiolytic-like effect. What does that mean?
I am not familiar with the word anxiolytic, but it sounds
Anxiolytic. I don't know if I'm saying that right. That's why I spelled it.
I don't know what that word is, but the previous thing that you said, say the previous part of that sentence again. It was like a decrease in.
The results showed that the consumption of sterculic oil decreased exploration latency in light dark tests, which suggests an anxiolytic-like effect. The alterations in time spent on rearing and grooming were present in open field tests, but this was not statistically significant, discarding non-specific motor alterations. The alterations found in this study are possibly related to intrinsic obesity and metabolic complications present in the Zucker rat model, where leptin plays an important role in animal mood more so than sterculic oil consumption.
Right. And so if they're saying it decreased exploratory latency, what that means is that means that the mice started to explore quicker when they had the sterculia oil. So, basically I think what that was, I haven't looked at that paper, right. And it's hard to, I'm more of a visual learner than an audio learner. But what it sounds to me like they're saying is that mice who lack leptin, well, this is a thing. Mice who lack leptin are very sedentary. They don't move around a lot. They're kind of they become very obese and they kind of just sit in one spot. This is another part of of lacking leptin in mice. And it sounds to me like what they're saying is that some of the sterculia oil actually made them get around and move a little bit more. Not a lot more, it sounds like, but if there's decreased exploratory latency, that to me suggests that they were, when it became dark, mice are nocturnal, so that when it became dark, they maybe got up and moved around more than.
They had more of a will to live, in other words.
They had more of a will to live, perhaps. So, I mean, that seems good. That's
how we take it back to philosophy, okay?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, hey, man, it's been a real pleasure. Wow, what a whirlwind tour. And we're going to have to leave it here. But I want people to check out fireinaBottle.net to read your blog. And also you'll see Firebrand meats there. You'll see some of the sterculic oil that you were talking about. You'll see the butter oil, the high stearic acid content butter oil. And you'll also see your other podcast appearances, which people can check out. So really appreciate you coming on.
Yep. And I'll be posting this one. And thanks for having me on. It was great.
Yeah, a lot of fun. Very interesting.
Yeah. All right.